All right, team, wanted to switch gears here for a moment. So much talk about COVID and the reopening and the politics and China and all that. You'll recall that the New York Times had this certainly ambitious effort to effectively rewrite American history with something called the 1619 Project. Underlying all of it is that the fundamental premise of America is rooted in slavery. That was one of the theses, perhaps the most prominent thesis in the whole thing. And now they're supposed to get a Pulitzer Prize this week for the 1619 Project. Well, we have a scholar with us now who takes issue with some major parts of the 1619 Project from the New York Times. We have Dr. Alan Guelzo. He has been a leading critic outlining the dangerous inaccuracies in the 1619 Project. He's a Heritage Foundation visiting fellow and is the senior research scholar at the Council of the Humanities at Princeton University. Dr. Guelzo, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, thank you for having me.
What are the biggest problems as you see it with the 1619 Project? And also, if you just give your overview of what they're trying to accomplish with the 1619 Project.
The 1619 Project, to put it in a short compass, is an attempt to recenter our understanding of American history. What they mean by recenter is to see the presence of slavery and race as the central narrative of American history. And in doing so, what they want to say about it is that American history has really been a history of oppression on the subject of slavery and race, hence the name of the project, which is the 1619 Project. Their insistence is that America did not really begin with 1776. America really began with 1619, which was the year that the first slaves were brought from Africa to colonial Virginia. And everything in American history can be understood as flowing downstream from that, whether it's the American Revolution, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's Abraham Lincoln, whether it's the American economy, whether it's even patterns of driving, rush hour driving in certain cities. It is a long ball thrown, so to speak, in terms of American history, but it is a long ball thrown mostly by journalists. And in this case, it's a journalistic initiative which has been severely and publicly criticized by at least two groups of historians and by numerous other individuals. And now the prospect is there's been a good deal of discussion about the 1619 Project being awarded a Pulitzer Prize. As it is, the 1619 Project originally appeared in August of 2019 as the full issue of the New York Times Magazine. What is in prospect now is that the 1619 Project's publication will be reissued in some kind of book form. And what's more, it's being adopted by school systems across the country. About 3,500 schools have adopted the 1619 Project as their interpretation of American history. And several large urban school districts, Buffalo, Washington, D.C., have adopted and made mandatory the use of the 1619 Project so that it becomes the narrative that K through 12 children are taught as the substance of American history.
Dr. Guelzo, what are some of the primary places that this narrative, just from the historical and factual perspective, where does it go wrong in ways that we need to be aware?
Well, let me give you three examples. One is the initial essay's in contention that the American Revolution was really designed, really hatched to protect slavery. You know, the American founders really, when they talked about liberty, when they talked about freedom from oppression, that really wasn't the real agenda. The real agenda was, how do we keep the British Empire from meddling with our ownership of slaves? So we staged the American Revolution to protect slavery. That's the contention of the opening essay. Now, this backfired a little bit, because several months after the publication of the 1619 Project, one of the consulting historians for the 1619 Project wrote an op-ed saying that she had, in fact, counseled the 1619 Project not to make this assertion because it was untrue, but her advice was waved away. This assertion was criticized by two Pulitzer Prize winning American historians, Gordon Wood, the dean of early American historians, and James McPherson. It's been criticized by numerous other American historians as a ridiculous extension of what is really an imaginary or an imagined scenario, because there is no concrete evidence that any of the founders ever suggested that they went into the American Revolution motivated by the urge to protect slavery. I mean, it just isn't there. This is an invention. And yet, as part of this overall recentering, we are asked by the 1619 Project to see that the American Revolution was really not about we the people. It was not about when in the course of human events. It was how can we protect slavery. All right, so there's one thing right there, which is a vast overstatement, to say the least. Secondly, another example is the 1619 Project insists that plantation slavery, as it was practiced in the pre-Civil War South, is really the model for the American capitalist economy. And that what you see in the functioning of American capitalism and American enterprise is really all built on the models and standards that were created for plantation slavery. Ergo, capitalism is slavery, or conversely, slavery is capitalism. If you want to ask where we get our capitalist economy, the 1619 Project's answer is it's all built on slavery. Now, once again, there are big problems with these assertions. First of all, one of the assertions is that plantation slavery was a very sophisticated capitalist enterprise because it used double-entry bookkeeping and it used a variety of other accounting practices. Well, the problem is that those accounting practices go back to the Italian Renaissance. They were not unique to the American South, much less to plantation slavery. And what's more, plantation slavery, yes, there are slaveholders who kept meticulous records, who kept account books, but there were also many, many others who did not, because plantation slavery was not something you could easily reduce to matters of numbers, not when you're using force, compulsion, and lethal violence to produce results. So the notion that slavery somehow is a capitalist enterprise, I mean, just on the concept itself, there's an exaggeration. The numbers that are cited, that somehow the American economy before the Civil War was so much a matter of plantation slavery that the profits generated by plantation slavery dwarf all those from any other enterprise in America. That is simply not true. Read the almanacs of the 1850s, which are teeming with economic data about the United States, and you find out that, in fact, there are more banks lending more money and possessing more capital in the state of New York alone than in the entire plantation South. So the models here and the numbers are an absurdity, and yet this is being offered as a sober interpretation of American history that we're supposed to recenter everything around.
We're speaking to Dr. Alan Guelzo of the Heritage Foundation and Princeton University. Dr. Guelzo, tell me about the outrageous lying slander of Abraham Lincoln, specifically that the 1619 Project engages in.
Well, that was the title of an op-ed in the New York Post. I did not write that title.
But you wrote the piece, so hopefully you could explain.
I wrote the piece.
Yes.
The editors of the Post wrote the title. It was a bit more lurid and theatrical than I would have chosen as a title. But nevertheless, I'll tell you the substance of the piece was a complaint, which I wrote about yet another aspect of the 1619 Project, and that's his treatment of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, in the way the 1619 Project presents the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln was a racist who planned the deportation of black people because black people were as they put it, a problem, a worrisome problem. Now, notice that in none of this is there any reference to the Emancipation Proclamation, that Lincoln frees slaves in 1863 by a presidential proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Notice there's no mention about a civil war being fought here. The one invocation of Abraham Lincoln is that he is a racist who regards blacks as a problem. All right, where does the term problem, worrisome problem, come from? It doesn't come from Lincoln. It comes from Lincoln quoting somebody else, in this case, Henry Clay. What we are dealing with is historical sloppiness that pushes things to an absurd degree. Every one of these things that I've mentioned, the American Revolution, plantation slavery, Lincoln himself, these are questions of enormous complexity, but they're treated by the 1619 Project with a wave of the hand and no research. Now, part of me wants to say this is what happens when journalists presume on the credulity of the public, because we trust what the press says. Even sometimes when we protest that we don't, we really do. Journalists sometimes think that they are writing what they call the first draft of history. That is a real compliment that journalists pay to themselves, and it's not always well earned, because journalists are not experienced as historians. Journalists operate under pressure to write dramatic copy that will fill the space of a 40-page newspaper or a 24-hour news cycle. And it's no surprise that we have seen a rash of journalistic hoaxes, some of which have gone up to the level of the Pulitzer Prize. I think, for instance, in 1980, Janet Cook and her series Jimmy's World for the Washington Post about a so-called 8-year-old crack addict. That earned her the Pulitzer Prize right up until the moment when people started asking embarrassing questions about her sources. And it turned out they were all, in fact, manufactured. The Pulitzer Prize had to be withdrawn. Same things have happened to the New York Times before. I recall the incident of Jason Blair in the New York Times in 2003, who filed fake stories concerning John Muhammad and John Malvo. These were stories that did not hold up. They were later investigated. It turned out that a number of things were entirely wrong about this, and then the journalist in question has to be quietly let go by the New York Times. And I have to say that even historians are not entirely proof against hoaxing. In 2000, a historian at Emory University, Michael Belle-Isle, published a book called Arming America, The Origins of a National Gun Culture, for which he won the Bancroft Prize. But later it turned out he was rather relentlessly tracked down by a lawyer who was suspicious about the notes on the sources, and it turned out that the sources that were being cited for the book could not be produced, at which point the Bancroft Prize had to be withdrawn, and Professor Belle-Isle lost his position with Emory University. All of these events occurred because of the confidence that the content of the articles or the content of the book would be politically applauded, even if the material was, shall we say, invented. But that's not the way to do history. That's carelessness. That's a lack of intellectual integrity. And what is surprising about the 1619 Project is that even after all the criticism, it's surprising that there should even be serious consideration for a Pulitzer Prize. After all the pointing out of errors, after one of the consultants for the project even compelled the project to admit and to issue a retraction, that the Pulitzer Prize would continue to be a matter of consideration for the 1619 Project simply beggars the imagination.
It's not about facts. It's about the narrative. Dr. Alan Guelzo of the Heritage Foundation and Princeton University, thank you, sir, for joining us. We appreciate your expertise.
All right. Thank you.